Ironing out how to provide Ukraine with sufficient security guarantees will be top of the agenda at a virtual meeting of NATO military leaders on Wednesday. US President Donald Trump has already ruled out sending US ground troops to the country in the event of any peace agreement with Russia. On Monday, Trump pledged to help guarantee Ukraine's security. That was during a meeting with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and European leaders at the White House. But in an interview with Fox News, Trump suggested the US may provide air support as part of a deal to end Russia's 3-year war in Ukraine. Speaking with journalists, the White House press secretary Karoline Leavitt gave more information about the president's position.
The president has definitively stated U.S. boots will not be on the ground in Ukraine, but we can certainly help in the coordination and perhaps provide other means of security guarantees to our European allies. The president understands security guarantees are crucially important to ensure a lasting peace, and he has directed his national security team to coordinate with our friends in Europe and also to continue to cooperate and discuss these matters with Ukraine and Russia as well.
DW Brussels correspondent Teri Schultz has more for us on this. Teri, tell us what options are on the table when NATO military leaders meet today.
Anya, these are NATO chiefs of defense, so that means the highest military officers in each NATO country are going to meet virtually today. And this really says to me that things are moving along quite quickly in terms of practical options that could be provided by European NATO members for this coalition of the willing that we're talking about, this effort to put a mission on the ground in case of an eventual ceasefire that would either be monitoring it or be defending lines that will be determined by this peace deal. We're not really sure yet what the operational mission will be, but the chiefs of defense are the officials in each country which have the best idea about exactly what resources they have, what kind of resources in terms of personnel could they contribute, what capabilities, what equipment could be moved in, what kind of training could they be giving to Ukrainian forces. So these guys are really doing the practical stuff there in this meeting at NATO headquarters today.
And from the American side, I mean, we're hearing from President Trump now that the US may provide air support to back a peace deal in Ukraine. What could that actually look like, that air support?
Well, neither President Trump or Karoline Leavitt, as we heard there, are giving us many details. And no one that I've talked to on this end knows for sure. They're just happy to hear that the U.S. may be willing to provide it, because this is one of the things that the European members of the coalition of the willing had been hoping for from the U.S. and had not been given a commitment that the U.S. would provide air support. And it could mean a lot of things. I mean, it could mean more help in missile defense for Ukraine, so that if a coalition were on the ground, Russia would have less ability to attack it from the air, if that's one of the things that they're worried about, providing more of an air shield over the areas of Ukraine that would now be protected in a peace deal. It could also mean that fighter aircraft are stationed nearby as a backstop, as it's usually described, in case a European soldier or in case Ukraine came under attack again by Russia. That's another practical step that the U.S. could provide. But otherwise, they really haven't given us much idea of what they're willing to commit to on air support. As I said, everyone's just happy that they're talking about it now, because that was a long time coming.
And Teri, you were saying that there is a sense of momentum here, but the Kremlin hasn't confirmed, has it, whether Putin is committed to a face-to-face meeting with President Zelenskyy. Is there anything European countries can do to bring Putin to the table?
I think they'll just continue the efforts they've been working on for the last more than 3 years of the war, and that is to pressure the Kremlin into understanding that it can't win the war militarily, that it's going to be crippled economically. The European Union is already working on its next round of sanctions, which they hope to adopt already in September, having just adopted the last package in July. That, of course, is more economic measures, trying to stop President Putin's ability to wage this this war. You know, the other thing that the EU could do collectively is to be willing to offer a site for these talks. Budapest has been mentioned, and you know the EU would then have to decide not to pressure Hungary on the commitment it has to arrest Putin as an indicted International Criminal Court suspect. So there are some things that they could do. We'll see how creative they get.
Teri, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much. That's DW's Brussels correspondent, Teri Schultz. Now, while, Ukraine's president and European leaders have hailed this week's talks in Washington as a huge step forward, our correspondent Juri Reschetto took a look at the reaction inside Russia.
С Владимиром Соловьевым.
Trump is good, the Europeans are bad.
Trump deserves enormous respect for his courage.
That's the official Russian view. The US president successfully resisted European attempts to sway him and pushed through what he had agreed to with Vladimir Putin. The anti-Russian warmongering coalition of the willing failed to outplay Trump on his turf, writes former President Dmitry Medvedev on X. Europe thanked and sucked up to him. Medvedev is considered a firebrand that has Kremlin leader Putin appear moderate and reasonable. And yet, Russia's best-known propagandist Vladimir Solovyov disagrees with Trump in one respect. A meeting between Putin and Zelenskyy isn't a done deal.
Russia means something completely different and is merely talking about raising the status of the existing delegation members.
Just like President Putin, Solovyov says the Ukrainian president isn't a legitimate ruler. Zelenskyy's term expired in May, he says. What he doesn't say is that Ukraine isn't allowed to hold elections during wartime by Ukrainian law. He argues that even if Putin were to meet Zelenskyy in person, Zelenskyy wouldn't have the mandate to sign treaties and agreements. Another YouTube commentator shares this view.
I don't believe in a meeting between Putin and Zelenskyy, even under Trump's supervision, regardless of the format. He's an illegitimate politician. There's no point in talking to him. Even if we wanted to agree on something with him, he's a nobody.
The moderators in this clip are discussing a territory swap between Russia and Ukraine and call into question Ukraine's territorial sovereignty.
Does Ukraine even have anything it could offer in exchange? Can they give us anything else? Then let's do this. Everyone is talking about security guarantees for Ukraine. Fine. Let's give them those guarantees. But in exchange, we'll get a few more territories. If they give us Odessa too, we'll swear on our lives that we'll never attack them.
The daily political show 60 Minutes on Russian television channel 1 is focusing on an alleged rift between Europe and America. In their eyes, the US is a reasonable discussion partner and trying to reach a deal with Moscow. Meanwhile, it accuses the Europeans of attempting to use a ceasefire to supply Ukraine with more weapons and continue the war.
Paris and London are trying to torpedo Trump's peace scenario at any cost,
concludes the presenter, accusing the EU directly of wanting to prevent peace.
DW's Riga bureau chief Juri Reschetto filed that report for us and joins me now for more. DW's Russia team has been based in Riga since being banned from reporting from Moscow. Good to see you, Juri. So your report there shows a very clear narrative in Russia. Is there space for any other perspective at all when it comes to these talks in Washington and a possible meeting between Putin and Zelenskyy?
Well, there is really only one interpretation, Anya, and that is the Russians have won. Whether or not this means the end of the war is unclear, but it's already clear, they say, according to all channels, that Ukraine would lose and also Europe would lose. Surprisingly, many now see the US as the winner and are glad, as if the US were not part of NATO and as if the US president hadn't received leading EU politicians in the White House on Monday. But according to the official line in Russia, the US is now on the side of the good Russians and the Europeans are on the other side with the bad Ukrainians. A few commentators dare to say that Donald Trump would be only working on his own image and wouldn't care about the war, which would therefore continue in any case because that is what the Europeans want.
So the Europeans being sort of portrayed as being on the other side. I mean, your report suggests that Russian political leaders are very much intending to sideline Europe in these discussions. Tell us a little bit more about their strategy.
Well, from the outset, the Russians wanted nothing to do with Europeans, but only with the US. This mirrors President Putin's perspective. He believes in a 20th century understanding of power in which major countries come to agreements among themselves and smaller states must accept the results. In the eyes of the Russians, Europe is a weak political power, and the Russians would like the EU to become even weaker. Why? Because Europe shares a free, democratic, liberal worldview that the Russians are doing everything they can to oppose in their own country and also in Europe, Anya. For years, they've been reportedly backing pro-Russian and Euro-skeptic movements, parties and groups with help of intelligence services. I'd like to remind you that the EU, the whole EU, all EU countries and almost all NATO countries except Turkey are included in the list of so-called unfriendly states. Those states the Russian government considers unfriendly mostly because of sanctions. The EU has now adopted 18 packages of sanctions against Russia, and we've just heard from Teri Schultz in Brussels, is going to adopt the next one, the 19th one.
We'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much for that. That's DW's Riga Bureau Chief Juri Reschetto. For more on this, I'm joined now by Domitilla Sagramoso. She's a senior lecturer in security and development at King's College London. Good to see you, Domitilla. Can you tell us more about what Ukraine is hoping for in terms of security guarantees and, of course, what its allies are willing to offer?
Yes, good morning. Yes, I think that what Ukraine would ideally wish is a robust presence of European or NATO member states deployed on Ukrainian territory, and with guarantees that the United States would intervene if there is another sort of Russian attack after ceasefire has been agreed. So this would be sort of the ideal solution. Of course, they would have wanted to be members of NATO, but this seems to be excluded at the moment. But the Europeans and the United States are talking along slightly different lines, but not entirely different. There is talk about sending what Europeans are calling a reassurance force, led primarily by the Brits and the French. This force would not be primarily engaged in war fighting, as was made clear by President Macron 2 days ago. The idea is that a lot of support is going to be provided to Ukrainian armed forces. So the armed forces are sort of the primary first line of defense, and the forces of the Europeans that would be deployed more on the back, they would be able to intervene if necessary. And here's where the question of American air support comes in, is to what extent the Americans would be able to support these forces if they get into trouble.
Well, that's right, because President Trump has ruled out sending US ground troops to the country, hasn't he? But he has hinted that the US may provide air support. So I did want to ask you, what could that look like, that possible US air support?
Well, it hasn't been really specified, so this is a bit speculative. I think what we are talking about, first of all, would be the US providing logistic support through air means, because this is something that Europeans to a certain extent lack. The logistic support of the United States has been very important, and that can be also carried out through the air. We could also be envisaging, for example, missile defense. The ideal situation would also be the imposition of a no-fly zone, probably in the western parts of Ukraine, but at the moment that is not really being considered as a likely possibility. But above all, I think what Europeans would hope is that the United States would provide air cover if necessary, if the European forces deployed on the ground get into trouble. Also, by air support, we might think of intelligence, because much of this intelligence is also provided through a whole air system that operates, for example, from the Black Sea, the Hawks planes, which are the ones that provide intelligence. So there's a lot that can be provided from the air, which not necessarily means that the United States becomes militarily directly engaged in this conflict, but provides the necessary support in logistics, intelligence, and others to make sure that European forces feel safe and can operate effectively on the ground if necessary and are well protected.
As you say, Domitilla, none of this is guaranteed or 100% clear yet. But given this talk of what security guarantees could look like, how is Russia reacting to this potential, kind of support from the US to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, that's a really important point, because the question is that the Russians have been very clear that they do not want any NATO troops. This has been repeated yesterday again by the Russian government, by the foreign minister. They do not want any NATO troops deployed on the ground in Ukraine. So I really don't really understand what kind of sort of agreement was reached or acceptance was made by Russia when Putin was in Alaska with the United States president, when it seemed that Putin had been sort of open to some kind of security guarantees. But if these are not provided by forces on the ground, then it becomes very unlikely that they would function. Another point that is important to highlight is that when there were discussions on this topic 3 years ago in 2022, the guarantees, when the guarantees were discussed initially, the Russians were saying that they would have a veto on the introduction of American or foreign forces into Ukraine. So the guarantees would be provided, but the Russians would have some kind of veto. And that is why this whole negotiations in April 22 in Istanbul didn't really work out, because you cannot have a country which is sort of the invader having a veto on other countries trying to come in to protect Ukraine. So it's not really clear what the Russians have in mind and what they would be ready to accept. And to me, that indicates that the Russians, in a way, would like to still push forward for the maximum positions, and they're ready to prolong these negotiations as long as necessary to make sure that they obtain what they really want, which is to make sure that Ukraine does not become a member of NATO, that it remains a neutral country with no presence of, Western European or NATO forces.
Domitilla Sagramoso from King's College London. Domitilla, thank you so much.
Thank you.